Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the second in the series of lectures geared towards CSEC and CAPE students, and hosted jointly by the St. Lucia National Reparation Committee and the Center for Reparation Research, with support from the UWI Open Campus and the Reparation Committee in Dominica, which we should be calling Waitukubuli in honor of the indigenous peoples. My name is Vereen Shepherd, and I am pleased to be your moderator today. I especially welcome Mr. Earl Bousquet and his team from Hewanora, and all the students, teachers, and parents who have logged in today. Our topic is a myth of extinction, indigenous peoples and their survival strategies. And it is very fitting that we should focus on this topic in the month of October because of the significance of the European invasion that started on October 12, 1492 for the first peoples of the region. As Julius Green points out in his booklet, Kalinago Myths, a retelling, and I quote, "Common to almost every culture is a set of myths," end of quote. Some relate to origins, some to local elements, some to supernatural elements. The myth on which we focus today, however, is not the one narrated by Green, but in a sense related to the counter discourse to the prevailing European narrative of origins, culture, and survival. Many Caribbean people are surprised when they meet a Kalinago, a Garifuna, Taino, or Maroon. They then begin to rethink the meaning of genocide. Our speakers will address all of these doubts and bring clarity to all the myths and stereotypes that too many of us harbor and perpetrate about the First Nation peoples. So I'm pleased to welcome especially our students. And I want now to introduce to you Mrs. Josephine Dublin Prince, a member of the Dominican Reparation Committee. She is going to bring greetings, but let me tell you something about her. She's a Cuban graduate in Trade Union and Women's Studies. In 1986, she became the General Secretary of the National Workers Union. She's now President of the Dominica National Council of Women and a local representative of CAFRA, which is the Caribbean Association for Feminist Research and Action. She's a former senator in the House of Assembly, the president of the DRC, Dominica National Community Tourism Association, and a community women and environmental activist. So, Mrs. Dublin Prince, the floor is yours to deliver your greetings. Mrs. Dublin Prince, the floor is yours to deliver your greetings to us. I think you have to unmute your mic, Mrs. Dublin Prince. We're ready for you.
Yes, you can hear me now.
Yes.
Right. So good morning to everyone. I am indeed honored to bring greetings from the National Reparation Committee of Dominica. I also want to bring you greetings from the Nature Isle of Waitukubuli. Of course, the topic which you have chosen, the myth of extinction, indigenous people and their survival strategies. It's very, very important. It's very timely. And of course, for us in Dominica, who have a population of indigenous people, we are very, very happy that that particular topic was identified. The National Reparation Committee of Dominica continues to bring to the fore the importance of recognizing the important role, the survival strategies, the culture of our brothers, our African descendants. And of course, we are very happy to be collaborating with the number of other CARICOM commissions to ensure that the true information is brought to our population. We are happy to be part of the re-education for our nation, for our own liberation. As we heard from our own Bob Marley, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. And that slavery usually begins from the mind. So through this series, we really want to thank and welcome the esteemed group of contributors, our own Dr. Leonard Honeychurch, historian, the Mr. Egbert Higuinho, Professor, of course, the esteemed moderator, Mr. Earl Bousquet, Honorable Kozia Frederick, our Kalinago colleague and Minister of Indigenous Affairs, Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson, Mr. Laura Jomo Japierre, Dr. Zachary, and all of the students who have joined us. And we are very happy that the students, the focus is on the youth, because it's through this re-education that they themselves can begin to inform themselves with what was really true. That, as we would have said, Columbus lied. Columbus never discovered the indigenous people were there before. So as we say, the discussion is also taking place at a time when we are commemorating in Dominica a 41st anniversary of independence, similar to St. Lucia and St. Vincent. And we're very happy that the whole focus on the Creole and our indigenous language is brought to the fore. Our cuisine, our part to ensuring that we are what we say we are, by ensuring that we know our history and we empower ourselves with what we know. So with this few words, I really want to thank you for allowing National Reparation Committee of Dominica to be part of this forum and to ensure that all those who are listening, especially the young persons, can ask the questions that they need to ask. We also want to thank all those who would be contributing, to thank them for accepting to re-educate us on such a timely and important topic. So kudos to the organizers, kudos to all of the reparation committees as we seek to go forward for a just and ethical struggle for reparation and reparatory justice. I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for those words. And it is now my pleasure to introduce to you one of our two main speakers, Dr. Leonard Honeychurch. And I think a lot of students know this name already, but of course, we do our introductions formally. So Dr. Leonard Honeychurch is a Dominican by birth and Canadian by descent. An anthropologist, historian, academic, and artist, his research is mainly concerned with the contact and cultural exchanges between the Kalinago people of the Lesser Antilles and arrivals from Europe and Africa. The only trained archaeologist stroke anthropologist in Dominica, Dr. Honeychurch studied as part of his master's degree in anthropology at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. During his tenure as curator of Dominica's archaeology storage unit at Fort Shirley, he identified the majority of the 40 pre-Columbian archaeological sites on the island and continues to work with and to provide local support for visiting archaeologists through his book, The Archaeology of Dominica. an honorary research fellow at the University of the West Indies and director of Island Heritage Initiatives Limited, a contracting company for restoration projects of heritage sites and cultural programs. Dr. Honeychurch currently works from his base in Dominica, where he is a member of the Dominica Reparations Committee. So Dr. Honeychurch, it's so great to have you. The students are very lucky today, and you have the floor for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. I hope that I am audible, that you can hear me.
We can hear you very clearly.
Very sorry that somehow my camera does not work and you will not see a moving image of me. But in this 15 minutes introduction, I want to make the point from, first of all, from being a member of the Reparations Committee. The first thing that I brought to the attention of the committee was that we do know, and in the Dominica case, our requirements are to deal with the reparations for the descendants of African enslaved labor brought to Dominica from Africa, and all of the things which happened over those hundreds of years within the Dominica situation. But also we are required to deal with reparations for the indigenous people. And as has been mentioned already, there are descendants of these people still living in Dominica. I'll be dealing a bit with that later. But one of the main points I wanted to make is that in effect, our demand for reparations is rather like a court case. Or for students, if you're doing an essay, you have got to provide proof of what you're saying. You've got to provide your sources and do your proper research so that your arguments are stable and well anchored in documentation. And so the first thing that I felt was required in the case of the indigenous people that we're dealing with specifically, but it is similar to that of the descendants of the African arrivals, is that it's a court case, essentially, and that what we must do is provide definite instances in which damage has been done, in which there has been human attacks and other incidents which affected deeply the people and their land and their association with the land. And so what we've got to do is from the very beginning, assess what happened and what was done in Dominica and by extension, the rest of the Caribbean. And when we're dealing with the Kalinago, of course, we're dealing with most of the Eastern Caribbean, moving into the Greater Antilles, into Puerto Rico, etc. And when we talk, first of all, about the survivors, there has been an error in the past of simply deciding that it is the look of a person that is going to determine whether they have antecedents, background, ancestors of the indigenous people. This, however, has been superseded by scientific knowledge in relation to the DNA. And back in 2011, there was a conference, an archaeological conference of the Regional Archaeological Organization in Puerto Rico, and a very important paper was presented where a study had been done on identifying the DNA component of the population of Puerto Rico. Now, traditionally, it had been said, oh, the remnants of the Taino are up in the hills there somewhere by Utuado, where they have got these ball courts, and there are a few scattered up in that area there. But by doing a scientific assessment in groups and testing across Puerto Rico, it was discovered that the DNA of the indigenous Taino is present to the extent of 60% of the population. And when this was announced in the conference room, I mean, the Puerto Rican audience got up and raised a great cry of exultation because it was defeating a concept of just dismissing the Taino and saying, oh, well, you know, there are hardly any left. Now, this is true across the Caribbean. Now, in Dominica, because of the fact that we are a very rugged island and our colonial process was extremely slow and limited to those areas where on the West Coast or where there were wide river valleys, the people retreated, the indigenous people, the Kalinago, retreated to the mountainous and rugged areas that were not desired for plantation agriculture. And that is why in 1903, the British administrator designated an area to be known as the Carib Reserve, which is now known as the Kalinago Territory, which is administered by a council and a chief. And in the state of, we have here with us, the Honorable Kozia Frederick, actually parliamentary representative of the district. So it is more formalized and more, people are more aware of it in Dominica. But once again, in Dominica, it's not just in the territory alone that has descendants of Kalinago. They are spread across the east coast of Dominica into many other villages. Some of them, if I'm talking to any Dominica students, you would know in the area of Penville and down south in Good Hope and Petit Soufriere, even into Delis and Bagatelle and Petite Savanne. And similarly, in places like St. Lucia, down in the area of the southwest, in the area between Choiseul and the Grand Piton, you will find areas where people are descendants. They may look like African descendants, but their culture in terms of their traditional skills and so is clearly linked to the indigenous Kalinago people. Similarly, little spots in the northeast of Martinique, and indeed in St. Vincent along the northern sections of St. Vincent. And if a similar study was done, as was done in Puerto Rico, I am sure that throughout these islands, including Grenada, and going up through those more rugged islands, we would find a higher percent if we did it through the DNA. So let us understand in scientific terms, there is a great survival, a greater survival than has been appreciated in the past. And a lot of my work has been to do, for instance, with cultural survivals. That is skills of boat building in terms of dugout canoes, the traditional canoes that are used in St. Vincent and Dominica, and for sport in Martinique, and also in St. Vincent to a lesser extent. And just by studying that and the positioning, for instance, the places where cassava is grown, you will find that, and basket making as well, Monde says in Martinique and the basketry in Dominica, by linking all of these cultural, creative aspects, we can identify links that go way back into the Kalinago era. Now, we will back that up also with documentation, historical documentation, particularly where treaties have been broken. And in the case of St. Vincent and Dominica, from 1630, we had a treaty called the Treaty of St. Christopher, where the French governor called together the Kalinago people of Yorome and Waitukubuli, bring them up to, and they came up in their canoes to Bastia, and signed, and it's clearly indicated that they put their symbols, their various symbols on the paper. In March of 1630, that St. Vincent and Dominica would be left in perpetuity forever to the indigenous people. This was reinforced in 1628 on ships anchored off Nevis, Charlestown in Nevis. And so we have our first of our treaties, and that have been broken. And then this was further emphasized. We have a massive rainstorm here in Dominica, so I'm going to be shouting a little bit. This has been emphasized further in the 18th century by the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle of 1748. And this re-emphasized that these two islands were going to be left in perpetuity. Well, of course, this didn't happen because by that time, the sugar industry was sweeping the Caribbean, and everybody wanted, in terms of the European powers, a new sugar colony. And so those treaties were swept aside. So we have that to argue about and to present. Then we have the massacres. We can collect across the region numerous massacres where the Europeans were trying to get rid, to eliminate the indigenous people so that they could take over their land. In Dominica, we have two main massacres, one in 1635 at a place that is now called Anse-Dimé. And then later on, we have the major massacre in a community that is still called Massac on the West Coast, where the indigenous mixed race chief, that is Carib Warner, Indian Warner, was massacred along with his village. So we have these cases which we also can quote and show that the action that was taken that has crippled effectively the Kalinago survival and expansion. We also have the records of land being appropriated. So from 1763, by the Treaty of Paris, both St. Vincent and Dominica were ceded to Britain. Britain took control and immediately sent out surveyors to cut the land into lots. The chief surveyor was somebody called John Byers. And the Byers map of both those islands delineate all areas that were taken from the indigenous people, particularly along the West Coast, particularly along the sort of gentler sloping sections of those two mountainous islands. And they were then dispersed and sold to British plantation owners. And the indigenous people were relegated to very small sections in the rugged parts of the island. So that is another transgression that we would record, the movement from their traditional lands. And here is where you have to get multidisciplinary. You've got to bring in the environment and the ecology and point out that, you know, indigenous people required large areas of natural vegetation, forest, and sea to be able to maintain the survival patterns. And this was wrecked, and that's another on the list. The other thing that creates a problem for us, and what shall we say, ties into the myth, is that in much of our CSEC literature, we find that not enough emphasis is played on what happened to the indigenous people. We get to a point where Columbus arrives, he passes through the island, he renames them, Spain takes some form of control, and then the British, Dutch, and English fight over the islands until sugar is established. And we kind of dismiss the whole struggle of the indigenous people very early on. I have tried to correct this in my books, The Caribbean People. In Caribbean People Book 2, we have a section related to the Greater Antilles and the Taino and what happened to them in that area where they were, the mass genocide took place, the population was decimated and the lands were taken. So we have an account of that. And then later on in the book, we have a section where specifically for the Kalinago people in the Eastern Caribbean to point this out, so that what we're trying to do in our literature for the schools is to ensure that the indigenous people are not dismissed early on and then forgotten. That you must remember the events that were taking place while the sugar revolution was in action across the islands. So all of these things have to be recorded to make the point, one, that the indigenous people were terribly treated after Columbus's falling upon the islands. Of course, you know, he was intending to try to get to Asia, and he tripped up upon these islands as he went along. But once the Spanish knew this and came out, the die was cast. Another thing that we must understand is what was going on in the European mind at this time. And that's a whole other story of the Spanish just having defeated in 1492 the Muslims. They had routed the Muslims and sent them out of Spain, and they were attacking the Jews and trying to establish a strong Christian Catholic faith. This was in their minds, and therefore they were prepared to eradicate anybody who they thought was heathen, pagan, or otherwise. An animistic religion, which was a tradition of indigenous people where there was multi-spirits, and the control was essentially for the benefit of their lands, of agriculture, of fertility, and that kind of thing. The Europeans could not understand that or refused to understand it. And this anti-indigenous religious movement had a very big impact on the European conflict with the indigenous people. So this is the important point I want to begin with is one, the actual accounts of what happened are very sparse for students at fifth form, sixth form level. Fourth, fifth form, you will find bits and pieces in various textbooks, but the whole subject is dismissed to a certain extent at that period of educational learning. When you go into university, of course, you can focus as you will on various aspects that will strengthen the detail. Then it's the question of what happened after and what affected the collapse of those societies. In the case of Dominica, you had, because of the terrain, because of the fact that it was very sparsely populated during the colonial era, the indigenous people were able to survive to a certain extent, small numbers of them. And in Martinique, for instance, we have a case where the early settlers, French settlers of Martinique, divided the island from north to south and designated the eastern side for the indigenous people. But then as sugar expanded, they wanted those lands, they took them over, and they made a deal with the indigenous people that you will be able to be free to roam wherever you wish, you will not be enslaved, on condition that you bring in any African maroons, any slaves who have escaped and are in the mountains of Martinique. And on those conditions, you will be able to continue your freedom. And of course, for many people, this was not acceptable. And very soon afterwards, the French took over the whole of Martinique, and many of those who were dispossessed left and went across the channel to Dominica. And we have movements back and forth across the Caribbean of indigenous people and of escaped African laborers from the plantations. For instance, by sea, from Barbados to St. Vincent, that's well recorded, and from other islands moving into St. Vincent and into Dominica. So here in ending, I think maybe, Madam Chair, I have got to my 15 minutes, but I wanted to make the main point that the record of the devastation of those indigenous societies is important to list so that you have a strong argument in the case of reparations. This is vital. You can go on and on about the ills, the wickedness, the genocide, but you have got to itemize these areas, and to do that, you need deep and concise research to be able to achieve that and to prove your point. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. And the students, I'm sure, have been enriched by your presentation, which is grounded in solid archival and archaeological research. And you have started to itemize some of these myths. I think you have said that one of the myths is that people can tell by just looking and you can't. You also have shown that really settlement in a rural mountainous area does not indicate where indigenous peoples are, because they are widespread. And in the case of Puerto Rico, a larger percentage of the population than was previously thought. And then you talked about the way in which science can help us to identify survival. And finally, how survival is not just about physical presence, but also about culture. So thank you ever so much. Our second speaker is Mr. Egbert Higuinho, and let me introduce him to you. I'm very happy to have met him. Mr. Higuinho is the current president of the Garifuna Nation, an advocate group that promotes the indigenous rights of its people who presently live along the coastlines of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. The Garifuna people are victims of European colonialism, deterritorialization, and genocide. They, according to him, there are approximately 800,000 Garifuna people inhabiting the Caribbean and the Americas, and that includes the USA. Mr. Higuinho earned his BA in English Literature from the University of Belize and did his studies in comparative literature at San Jose State University, where he obtained an MPhil in philosophy. He has taught at the high school level in Belize, Oakland, Tracy, and San Jose cities, and now he teaches and lectures adults on English composition, comparative literature, logic, critical thinking, and philosophy. Senor Higuinho has attended several international conferences where he published and presented pieces concerned with racism, justice, immigration, poverty, and liberation theology. So a wide-ranging, multidisciplinary interest. So the floor is yours, and I'm sure we'll all be really enriched by your presentation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vereen Shepherd, distinguished guests. That was a very interesting discussion there, Leonard. Very much appreciated. And I want to say that I'll need to stay in touch with you. Greetings from Belize, even though I'm living in California, but on behalf of my folks from Belize, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, the Garifuna people are alive. We are not only in museums, we are living and we're here, and we're not going anywhere. Could you show the slides, John? So I want to say Mabwiga, Uiti Binafi, in my language, Garifuna Balisina. I'm saying, hello, how are you? I'm Garifuna from Belize. Next slide, please. So I want to enter this discussion, just to touch you from across the Caribbean, from Belize. Garifuna is the word, the name we use to describe ourselves since the Anglo-Saxons would use Black Caribs. We use the word in our language Garifuna, referring to our brothers and sisters in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and other parts of the Caribbean, but more concentrated in Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. A new phenomenon that I would want to sometimes refer to as a nation emerging beyond borders. Next slide, please. So there is Belize, just to give you, a geographical location, tucked between Guatemala and Honduras. And our people, the Garifunas, live mostly along the coast of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So we are linked by communities that are dotted along the coastline of those 4 Central American countries. Next slide. So there's Belize. Once you get to Florida, it's an 1.5 hour flight from Florida to Belize. Next slide. So I want to give you a little demographics on Belize. It is a British colony in Central America with a population of 400,000 people. It's twice the size of Jamaica. So, you know, it's not as populated. It has the second largest barrier reef in the world, but I say it is the largest living barrier reef in the world. It's good for snorkeling and scuba diving. The population of Belize comprises 30% Afro-descendants, of which 10% are Garifuna, and the other 60% are Mestizo, including the indigenous Mayans. Next slide. If you come to my hometown, where I was born in Grigo, Belize, you'll be greeted by this grand Garifuna monument, which we refer to as drums of our fathers, waiting to greet you. Next slide. And of course, you know, we have several islands dotting the barrier reef that is good for tourism, but we, the Garifunas, use it to collect cultural items that help us, you know, with our culture artifacts. Next slide. To understand the Garifuna, I think Dr. Lennox also made reference to the Africana ancestry in the Garifuna and the Carib Arawak that merged with the Africana ancestry to bring a new people called Garifuna. And I have interest. More work needs to be done. So I like this conversation that we are having, because more work needs to be done as to perhaps retrieve what part of West Africa has influenced the Garifuna culture. Because we know that the language we speak, the language linguistically, is to a large extent Carib and Arawak. Next slide, John. So this is a historical genealogy. 500 BC, the Arawaks were moving from South America by way of Venezuela, up through Trinidad, through the Lesser Antilles, including St. Vincent, Dominica, Barbados, and so on. Pursuing the Arawaks were the Caribs. And this is where I think we need to have more discussion as to the Africans merging with the Caribs, because we don't have much information there. I have done a lot of work on it, you know, it's coming to us. So that by 1492, when Columbus came, there were already this population of Garifuna people concentrated on the island of St. Vincent, and, you know, having this civilization that was a part of the Garifuna nation before 1400s. We want to believe that the Garifuna nation was already in existence before, you know, the arrival of Columbus, 1492. So much so, and I think Dr. Lennox mentioned there were like, we recorded that there was a 30-year war with the British. Before, we had skirmishes with the Spanish, you know, Columbus and his entourage, and he was not successful in terms of subjugating the Garifunas, Black Caribs on the island of St. Vincent. That history needs to be like revisited, you know. But by 1635, when the British came in, there was resistance from the Black Caribs. That ended after a 30-year war in 1796. I'm moving very quickly through the history here. 1796, we lost the war to the British. And after, you know, so many treaties, you know, that they were not honoring, we had war, we had fight, there was a resistance on the island of St. Vincent. But 1796, 5,000 people, there's records to show, 5,000 people from the island of St. Vincent were rounded up and put on a barren island called Balisao, where they were starved, right? And the records show that of the 5,000, 2,500 people died on the island. Some of my ancestors have been going to Balisao as a way of pilgrimage, and they are coming back and saying there are still bones on the island. And we are in the process of trying to negotiate to leave that Balisao island as a kind of memorial. We understand the private person who owns it right now wants to talk to us, and we do appreciate it. But 1796, the British decided to round up the other 2,500 people and take them to, they couldn't quite decide, according to the records. They wanted to put them in Jamaica, but they decided that the Maroons were already there, and to join these, fierce, fighting people with another, group of resistance would be too much. So they decided to take them to the coast, just off the coast of Honduras, in an island called Rotan. They dumped them there, and I said that perhaps they dumped them there for cannon fodder, because the British were always fighting with the Spanish. And so they put them there to kind of, some kind of military tactic for the British that they were trying to pursue in terms of dominating the Central American region. You know this, 1797, we are in Honduras, but by that time, because the Garifuna people, Black Arabs, were dexterous boat manipulators, they were able to spread out on the Central American coast. Next slide, please. So this is, just like historical, that's what happened on the island of St. Vincent. 1796, the British forces conquered the Garifuna, imprisoned them on Balisao, half of the 5,000 perished. 1797, they're already in Honduras, and by 1800s, they're already in Belize. There's records to show that they were in Belize by the 1800s. Now, there's a theory that the Garifunas were, mainly from, slave ship that wrecked on the coast of St. Vincent. There's reason to believe that the Garifunas are more than just a, contingent of shipwrecked Africans. Next slide. So the British genocide started in St. Vincent in the Caribbean. It was, to me, a project of genocide, a project of deterritorialization, to take away people's land by, devious means, deception. And Dr. Lennox has pointed out that we have record to show that, we were being exploited and starved, murdered, and so on. Next slide. So I put this map so that students could see the, understand the geography, what's going on. We are made up of indigenous people from Venezuela, the Caribs and the Arawaks, and we had a civilization, a merged civilization of Africana and Carib Arawak merging here in the Caribbean. And now we are present in Central America, Belize, Guatemala, Honduras. Next slide. I put this here so that you could know we have names for our own food. The Manana is cassava. Many of you are familiar with this. And there's a process. I'm very amazed of my, people that there are two types of cassava. There's the bitter cassava and there's the sweet cassava. The sweet cassava, you could just put it in the pot, boil it. Could you, next slide. But the bitter cassava is processed. We have a, technology that we extract the hydrogen cyanide from that bitter cassava, and we bake, after grating the cassava and strain out the poisonous juice, we bake it and produce this high fiber food we call in Garifuna ereba, baked cassava, which is one of our staple food items. Next slide. Another staple of our is hudut. We call it hudut. Other people in the Caribbean would refer to it as fufu, beet, green, ripe plantain, and it goes with coconut gravy. And there's a whole technology that goes with this food preparation, which is something that Dr. Lennox alluded to, the technology of our foods that keep us healthy. And there's a time somebody came into our community and told us that coconut is no good. Coconut is high, in some bad cholesterol. Scared the hell out of my community, and now, they are back with coconut oil, virgin coconut oil. It's good for you. It's good for everything. It's good for our old age. And the thing that the Europeans do with our community is so disgusting. Next slide. I wanted to show this to the students. Aragua is one of our dances that is featured mostly during the Christmas time, during Yuletide time. And notice the outfit. It's like the tunic of a British military soldier. And it is said that we are imitating the Europeans. I don't know, because we have more rhythm, but it's a way of celebrating around the Yuletide season. Next slide. During the Christmas season, you have different groups in Grigo, where I grew up, and that go from house to house, and the dancers are, exhibiting different moves. It's we have drummers and singers who would call songs that are related to this particular one Aragua dance, which we assume is a kind of war dance. And I noticed that young people now are not only dancing around Christmas time, they are using different months of the year to exhibit and to keep this culture alive, which I very much appreciate. Next slide. Another dance that we have is the Punta, and you could see it's right there in somebody's wake. We do Punta for as a way of exhibiting fertility and happiness, and so that's one of our 7 dances that we usually have around wakes. Next slide. This is a shot of a religious ceremony about to take place. You notice there's the sea in the background. The women are bringing products from the keys to give to our ancestors. And so this is a religious picture, a picture of our religious ceremony that's just about to begin. The religious ceremony is called Dugu, and the ancestors usually call on our people, or the priestess or priest. We will refer to them as the buye in our language. We won't use the word priestess. I just want to make the connection. The buye are the ones who would, lead this religious ceremony, and it's very much alive in our culture today. Next slide. I'm just exhibiting this to show that the young people are very much enthused about the culture, very proud to be a Garifuna, and so this is an exhibition on stage. Next slide. We have our icons and the Palacio, very popular Parandis. Paranda is another genre of music in the Garifuna culture. The artists use lead guitars, and it's like a form of jazz where they're reflecting on, the experiences of individuals and the community. Next slide. Aurelio is another Parandis. You notice his lead guitar, and Paranda is, to me, the closest I could say is close to like the jazz. All right. Next slide. Again, young people keeping the culture alive, practicing the songs, the language, the dance, and so we are here. Next slide. So UNESCO has declared that the Garifuna language, dance, and music belongs to the Arawakan group of languages that has, survived centuries of discrimination and linguistic domination. Next slide. In our communities of Belize, Guatemala, Honduras, we do not get much support from the authorities, right? Most of these cultural artifacts, the songs, the music are not taught in schools. Recently, there are a few moves by individual pockets within perhaps ministries that are making some gestures as to recognize indigenous rights, but it's not deep enough. For example, in Honduras at the moment, the Honduras government is actually killing some of our people on the coast, and we are about to challenge that. Next slide. So in the context of cultural survival and retrieval, UNESCO proclaimed that the Garifuna language is a masterpiece of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity. This was declared in 2001. I'm very much, you know, as a linguist, student, just wanted to know the language that was, you know, exhibited here, the language, dance, music of Belize. I kind of have been able to talk to the originators of this declaration. Why is it that only Belize was, you know, identified as the promoters? Because I know my brothers in Honduras and Guatemala are also a part of the Garifuna Nation. Next slide. So for my students, I like to always show them a visual map so they could know how we are, you know, connected, how we are tied, how we are linked, you know, in the Caribbean Sea. And when I was growing up, I was always wondering, this Caribbean Sea. I'm a Black Caribbean, so, you know, I declare we own this. This is ours. So we need to, you know, fight for it. Next slide. More slides. Next slide. I wanted to show, you know, that the young people are very active. They are into the culture, even though, you know, a few older folks might say, well, you know, they're kind of commercializing it. Well, they're moving it in their own way. We have a museum in Grigo that the culture has, you know, started about maybe 5 years ago. There's a monument that, you know, the community built so as to indicate to the country that we are here. We are going nowhere. Next slide. We celebrate our culture in Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua. This is perhaps a Punta dance. Next slide. We are trying to organize ourselves. And as a leader of the Garifuna Nation, I am celebrating our women in the culture. I have the theme for the conference that we are having to bring the community together as we face this onslaught of globalization, to bring our women together and to give them the support that they need so that we could, you know, push the Garifuna Nation forward. With that, I say, we are bringing good tidings from the Garifuna indigenous people of Central America. We are 20,000 in Belize, 5,000 in Guatemala, about 200,000 in Honduras, 2,000 in Nicaragua, and about 300 in the US. We are here. The indigenous people are here. The Garifuna, Black Caribs from St. Vincent. And we have been going back to St. Vincent to tell our brothers, hey, we're going nowhere. And we are here for the reparations of our people. Ayo, I end my discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Higuinho, Senor. I'm so glad you reached out to us and that you could bring us comparative information about the indigenous peoples in Belize, you know, provide that comparative context. 2 questions have come in for you, but we'll wait until the Q&A session to pose those questions for you. It's now time to introduce our 3 discussants who will pick up on any aspect of the 2 presentations that we just heard, and they each have 6 minutes in which to do so. Let me apologize right away. We heard that Dr. Leslie Gale Atkinson Swaby has a power cut. You know how it is now in this time of COVID-19 and the pressure on the facilities, and also the fact that it's raining in many communities and power sometimes is the first thing to go. So let me begin with Honorable Kozia Frederick, who is a former teacher and a development officer, a person who is described as a community man, who defends the indigenous rights, who plans events, and who plays music in various bands. He is a graduate of the University of the West Indies at the Cave Hill campus. We're very proud of that. As a member of an ethnic minority of Dominica and being of Kalinago descent, he feels strongly that the points of view of the Kalinago must be aired. As an artisan and musician, he also feels deeply about developing aspects of the culture that help to portray to the Kalinago community's uniqueness within the region and within our global village. Honorable Frederick is a serving cabinet minister in Waitukubuli, Dominica, after successfully contesting the Salibia seat for the Dominica Labour Party in the 2019 general elections. he was appointed Minister of Environment, Rural Modernization, and Kalinago Upliftment. I'm going to introduce all our discussants one time and before I call on them to speak. So, of course, Mr. Laurent Jean-Pierre is the Archaeological Secretary of the St. Lucia Archaeological and Historical Society and is representative of the National Reparations Committee. He's also an executive member of the St. Lucia National Trust and the National Archives of St. Lucia. He is an established ethnobotanist, a biocultural heritage researcher, and a member of International Association of Archaeology and Museum of the Caribbean. Jean-Pierre is a member of the regional medicinal plant research body named TRAMIL, that is Traditional Medicines of the Islands, which has been researching Caribbean medicinal herbs for over 30 years. He was also the founder and curator of the St. Lucia National Herbarium and has a plant named after him, oh my goodness, which is located at the top of Petit Piton. Wow, you have to show that to us when we visit. And of course, you know, it's the tallest of the island's 2 World Heritage Site landmarks. I'll also introduce Dr. Zachary Bayer, who is a lecturer in the Department of History and Archaeology and the director of the Archaeology Lab at the University of the Western Mona campus in Kingston, Jamaica. Additionally, he currently serves as the president of the Archaeological Society of Jamaica, ASJ, and is a trustee on the board of the Jamaica National Heritage Trust. We call it the JNHT, and I was board chair some many years ago. Dr. Bayer's research focuses on the archaeology and heritage of the Caribbean at both prehistoric and historical sites, and principally the diversity of human encounters in the emergent modern world. He completed his PhD at Syracuse University in the USA in 2017 with a dissertation that examined archival and archaeological evidence from the households of enslaved laborers and soldiers of African descent at a British military fortification on the Caribbean island of Dominica or Waitukubuli. Along with teaching courses in archaeology and heritage studies, Dr. Bayer is presently engaged in a variety of archaeological projects in Jamaica, including work at Kingston Harbor, and that is where most of our enslaved Africans disembarked, but the Kingston Harbor fortifications, a former plantation, and Second World War internment camp on the UWI Mona campus, and at one of the largest indigenous villages in Jamaica, White Marl, which dates AD 900 to 1600. So as I said, each has 5 minutes and will speak in the order in which they were introduced. So it is now time to give the floor to the Honorable Kozia Frederick to comment on the presentations. Over to you, Honorable Kozia Frederick.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you to my esteemed colleagues here. I also thank you to the CRC for giving this this small indigenous brother from Dominica an opportunity to share. I just want to say that we are very much alive on the island, and to say that I will try to make my presentation. I will zero my presentation in on the wonderful space that nurtured me and that and gave me an opportunity to grow and to be empowered to speak on their behalf. So the Kalinago territory, we will know from the historical facts that the demise of the people of the Caribbean region started in the 1450s. We know there was a papal bull. We knew that there was this discovery. We knew that people had to be subjugated, and it was a Christian doctrine that actually began the entire demise of the people. So I will fast forward to 1903, when the British decided to demarcate an area for us on the island. So the strategy here, I have argued, was one of isolation. So we moved beyond open warfare. we move beyond that military resistance, and we use isolation as that strategy to survive. So we move into this isolated area, which we now know as the Carnival territory, and I have argued that the British were forced to honor that space because we were protecting that space. It was a natural fortress, and British had no choice in 1903 but to demarcate it our space and to allow us some form of self-determination. So that space is about 3,700 acres of land. It's about 2%, only 2% of the land mass of the island. And at that time of the British demarcation, it was referred to as the Carib Quarter. In terms of the geography, to the east is the harsh Atlantic Ocean, to the west the rugged forest of Dominica, to the north and south we have privately owned lands. So we are land and sea and forest bound. In order to survive within the colonial state, we exercise a sovereign right to self-determination, and we function within a communal society centered on subsistence farming, weaving, fishing, etc. Now, this resilience caused a conflict between the Kalinago people and the central government authorities only 27 years after the establishment. So in 1930, we have what is recorded in the historical context as the Carib War or the Carib Fracas. And it was simply one that that the people will continue a tradition of trade with neighboring islands for survival, and that trade was deemed illegal by the authorities, and the authorities invaded our sacred space, and there was a resistant effort. At that point, the leadership of the Carnival territory was dismantled. So the legal rights of a chief to operate within that space was made null and void. His staff was taken from him, and he was not allowed to be called chief or king of the Carnival people. So it was 22 years later, in 1952, when the government had a move for local government, that the chief was reinstated. And so from 1952 all the way to 1978, independence, and we are now in the independence period, that the colonial government at the time acknowledged again the presence of a chief and his right to govern and to speak on behalf of that people. So at the point of in 1978, with the independence project, the Carnival territory was inculcated into the general Dominican governance structure, and we have realized that at the time of the arguments for independence, there had to be a confirmation by the Carnival people to be part of the independence process. It is something that has been discounted for some time, and it's something we have to speak on, because without the authorization of the indigenous population, white Dominica, as we know it, the Commonwealth of Dominica, would not be that state, because the colonial government gave some authority to that particular space. What is interesting is that while we were down the route of being self-governed and had a strong self-determination drive, we realized that the communal ownership of land was an issue for us to a certain extent, because we were now operating within the construct of a capitalist governance framework, and we were unable to economically develop because the lands were in common. And there have been many arguments over the years to if you want to survive within that capitalist framework, especially as we speak about survival strategies, that we should move toward privatizing the lands, and so that these lands can now serve as collateral. Many have argued, and I am one of those who argue against that move, because when the land is demarcated into private lots, it is so much easier to lose that land space and to lose the heritage, because it's not open market, and the natural predecessor to the colonial enterprise. The capitalist movement will go in there and dismantle that place. Within the context of the Carnago territory, we see it was only in the 1970s that we got public infrastructures through a road network. Electricity came in the 1980s. It was only in the mid-1990s that we had a water system coming in that space. So all of this speaks to the fact that even within the constructs of an independent state, the people had to survive and find creative means of surviving for themselves. So they are still within what I argue to be within the constructs of isolation, able to survive with all of this support and all of the trappings of the government at the time. Another interesting issue within the context of the Carnago territory is the fact that the colonial experience was almost totally complete because the language was dismantled. There was no cosmogony. So as we speak, the population is predominantly Christian. People partake in very little aspects of any form of ancient Carnago traditions because these traditions were lost and they're buried. We will never know the great cathedrals that the Carnago would have built. We will never know the great spiritual leaders that would have emerged. We will never know. So it is something that has to be studied, has to be brought to the fore. However, subtle traditions remain that survived in sort of the periphery of the predominantly Christian society. So there's a consistent use of herbal medicines. People do baths to ward off evil spirits and the like, and so rituals were part of that condition. But all of these were happening within the corners and the dark corners of the communities, because like the past disposition, those things who seemed ungodly, unchristian, and they had to be tucked away into the back burners. The community itself, political, is also important. The political structures that allowed it to survive within the colonial experience also helps it to survive within the context of 21st century. And so the community is part of a wider constituency, which I am proud to serve. We share that constituency with a neighboring village. However, one of the important things that I think which is not part of the national discourse, is the fact that the people the adjoining community share a lot of the heritage, and like Comrade Lennox spoke to, there's no, you can't put a face. It's not the features, and even within the colonial experience, we have a lot of records telling that the European eye could not discern the difference between any people. So we have that situation on the island here, and so within the government and structures, we are making some amends to right some of those wrongs. And so the key pillars that keeps the people alive within this space is the understanding that there was a formal establishment of the reserve, understanding that there was an uprising that stood for governance and self-determination, the understanding that there was a reinstatement of the tribal chief, the understanding that we were part of the independence project, and in 2000 we had an establishment of a Carnago or Indigenous Department of Government, and in 2014 we had the official name reinstated. So we are moved over in 2014. We're not speaking of Caribbean anymore, and we're speaking about the name that we call ourselves, the Carinago. So it is within this context that I have argued that we will continue to survive, because we are very much aware of our influence on the Dominican landscape. To close, there are a number of elements of the Dominican culture that highlights the Carinago heritage, and even as we speak, we are in what we call the Creole mode. It's the Creole week of activities leading to independence on the 3rd, and the Creole, I've argued, is built on 3 pillars. The 3 pillars are some of the European designs, African heritage, and Kainago heritage. So there are three pillars. And any of you who have been out camping or been in the rural areas, you would understand the firestone concept, where you have three firestones. You light a fire, you put a pot over it, and you do a meal. You cook a meal to survive. And the Kainago is one of those pillars. And if we take off the Kainago pillar, that pot here would for sure topple. I would have nothing to eat. So within the context of this, within the context of the Independence Project, we have to ensure that the aspects of indigenous heritage that survives in the names of plants, the names of animals, the names of concepts, the names of villages are reinforced. Because if we decide to take off what is ours from that Creole culture, we may have something that is very modeled and something that will not function. I just want to say thank you for the intervention and for having me here. I also want to thank some of the elders who have empowered me in my journey. We have present today 5 Kainago chiefs, two coming from the pre-independence period, Mas Clement, Faustus Frederick. We have Irving August, Garnet, Joseph, Charles Williams, and we do now have a very young chief, 22 years old, Lorenzo Sanford. They're there, and they are testimony that the Kainago people will continuously survive within that space. And we have a number of cultural elders who do their bit in the names of Prosper Paris, Gerald Langley, and all of those people are what I deem the soul layers who will carry on that torch, carry on that battle forward to continue to survive. And we are now faced with a pandemic, and we are going to survive this. I have argued that we have survived disease, we have survived the weapons of the steel, we have survived the capitalist project of exploitation of labor. We have done that. We will get through this pandemic, and I suspect we have a lot to offer to humanity in terms of how we survive within this new digital age, because we can't have an interaction physically, but we could do it via this medium. And I suspect it will be another medium that I would want to encourage students. I would speak to them to use to explore the various aspects of indigenous heritage that survive in the Caribbean and will continue to survive long before we are gone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kozia Frederick. I'm sure there may be questions and you will intervene again later on. But I know that Jean-Pierre was having some difficulties. If he's on now, I invite him to make his 5 minutes intervention. Is he here with us, Jean-Pierre? Laurent, Jean-Pierre? No?
He's not. He's still trying to get in. I suspect he has that same problem that Lennox had earlier. He says he's been trying for 40 minutes.
Oh my goodness. All right. Well, in the meantime, let me call then on Dr. Zachary Bayer to make his intervention. Zachary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Shepard. Thank you, Mr. Jean, excuse me, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, Mr. Higuinho, and our other contributors. This is a pleasure, and I especially want to send a thank you for the our audience of young scholars. I'm hoping that this is relevant and inspiring. Indigenous people are certainly here. Kalinago, Garifuna, Taino. I want to use this opportunity today to speak to some of the issues that have already been raised. So I'm not going to go too much into strategies, but use the moment to talk about I think it was mentioned, a wonderful space. And for me, I came to this region very much as a historical archaeology working on colonial forts, but not only the sites, the archaeology, but the renaissance that's taking place right now in terms of indigenous identity. I want to put myself into the position to be a strong advocate, and like Dr. Honeychurch has said, using science hand in hand with social activism, social justice to represent indigeneity and to correct some historical imbalances. So in terms of strategies of resistance, these strategies, I think we can think of these not only as the strategies taken in the past, but what are our strategies today, connecting what often seems so distant of a past to our immediate activities right now. A few presenters have discussed population retreats historically, and you do see that following the advent of European colonialism. But interestingly, it's not all retreat. And perhaps this recent evidence from coming from ancient DNA is showing us that there's persistence historically as well. Sites, including the wonderful space I will highlight a bit more following these initial remarks of White Marl, but also sites in Haiti and Bas-Saline, where you see the continuity of indigenous societies for at least another generation, with very little presence of European material culture in an archaeological mindset that shows you not only you have persistence, but you have forms of resistance going on, albeit with changes to indigenous societies. Male daily activities and the artifacts representing that reduced as a result of coerced labor and encomienda practices, while the activities of women, females, take on even more significance, not only in these indigenous lands, at these indigenous sites, but also what you see at early European sites, including those in Jamaica, like Sevilla La Nueva. We see the presence of Taino, indigenous foodways, ceramic cultures that are persisting within these sites as well. So persistence is a strong, not only argument, but a strong reality coming from the archaeological record. But there's also, I think more importantly, beyond commitment to research, assessing what took place in the past, so systematic archaeological investigations, the archival research that Dr. Honeychurch highlighted. But we also, as advocates, need to work with government agencies and multinational corporations to ensure that the sites of indigenous experience are not destroyed, along with plans of prosperity, plans of progress. Both of preservation, progress can work hand in hand, and those aren't even just forces for island nations. It's not only human forces, it's also environmental forces, climate change. We need to be particularly cognizant of coastal settlements, settlements in higher elevations that are now inundated soil and destroyed by soil erosion. And then also pursuing reparation claims for the return of illegally transferred materials that would have left the islands. I mean, still ongoing, but most certainly during the 18th and 19th century, with the idea of bringing these objects of identity home within institutions that are also receiving the necessary support in order to engage with our young scholars, continue to motivate our citizens that either identify biologically as indigenous or recognize the importance right here, right now of their cultural survival. So bottom line, it's also about not forgetting. Especially in the Jamaican context, the beginnings of my research was in Dominica, and Dr. Honeychurch, I miss you. It's been a long time. We spent a lot of good times at the Cabritz Garrison, but where you have representatives of an indigenous community that are vocal, that I've been to the Kalinago village, that you can visit and be welcomed by by people, by cultural knowledge that has persisted in these islands for thousands of years. So we can't forget. And in Jamaica, though, I think the process of forgetting has perhaps been more drastic, and the issue of appearance was raised, that, oh, you don't look like Taino, you don't look indigenous, so most certainly there's no space for you here. We know that indigeneity is written in blood, it's written in the soil of these lands, and it's persisting through cultural tradition. So what I am pleased to see in Jamaica is not only active archaeological research going on, and I hope to use just a minute to show you some of this. And this is archaeological research happening in the face of destruction, the expansion of a highway. So really a form of rescue activities. But also I'm pleased to see the recent nomination of a new Taino chief after hundreds of years. We've recently seen that in Jamaica in the last 2 years or so. So interesting movements. Let me just share one moment, a screen here, so I can just walk you through the wonderful place of white marl, but that my dear mother before the pandemic, when she visited, described as tragically giving, right? It's a site that you can walk into, you can access. Prof. Shepard was there during the course of excavations. Artifactual remains are literally pouring out over these slopes. It was an area that has been known about since the 19th century and recognized as the largest indigenous Taino site on the island. There was some significant research in the 50s and the 60s that led into the establishment of the White Marl Museum by the 70s. That research is now dissipated. The museum closed down in the early 2000s, really preventing the proper interpretation of the site in a public space, right? So since 2016, with the proposed plans to expand the Nelson Mandela Highway, we've been out on site at 2 different sections. You can kind of see blown up sections of this here. One inside the medium between the eastbound, westbound lanes of the Mandela Highway, and another large area directly behind the now abandoned White Marl Museum. And the findings are significant. Again, excavations of human remains should only take place with not only the necessary permissions, but with only based on mitigation, removal in the face of destruction. I thought a very good point was raised about Roatan, about the preservation of that area as an island of memory. Ideally, White Marl should do that. We should do that at this site, but a highway is already running through it, and it's about to be expanded to include even more. But you can see White Marl, it's significant in terms of the material culture, but also so lifeways, behavior, artifacts represent behaviors, but also deathways. You got an incredible, well-preserved database of human remains. And since 2016, we've excavated and are now in the process of studying around 10 of these individuals. Burial 1 is particularly significant. And again, using advanced archaeological analysis, we've been able to determine diet from starch grains on the teeth, including the oldest evidence of cacao so far, chocolate so far identified in the region, well before the Spanish came over with their own varieties. So that's significant. You also have burial 2, and I should say the date range is 1300 to 1400 before Spanish conquest. Burial 2, fragmentary but similar time period. This is an individual based on isotope analysis, which is done on the bones and the teeth, can show you your diet. We are what we eat. So where we're raised, your isotopic signature will reflect that type of marine or terrestrial diet. This individual is likely, even though they were buried at White Marl, they likely came from another region in Jamaica or another island entirely. So again, showing you these strategies of migration that after colonization, Spanish conquest, likely were still ongoing to a certain degree. And this individual is particularly significant. Look at the date here. In terms of continuity, this idea of immediate extinction, that is not what you see from the evidence of White Marl. This is an older female individual buried between 1488 and it's a wide date range, but as late as 1645. We know in Jamaica, 1509, Sevilla Nueva was established. By 1533, Spanish Town, which White Marl is right next to, was established. This means you have at least a generation and a half of persistence at a site like White Marl. I think I think I'll end my remarks there. I just want to say ongoing research is being done on ancient DNA, as Dr. Honeychurch mentioned, specific to Jamaica. Thus far, islands including Dominica, Jamaica have not been included in these regional ancient DNA studies. I'm working right now with collaborators locally here, as well as abroad in the Harvard DNA lab, to ensure that the samples recently excavated and those stored in collections in Jamaica can be properly tested and determine what relationships Jamaicans have with surrounding islands and also pre-Columbian populations with contemporary Jamaicans. I think we're going to find Taino survival persistence and thus the need in Jamaica to add Taino identity into popular forms of expression and obviously for claims of reparation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Zach. I found that very important, very interesting, but very troubling. And I think we'll have some questions to ask about that in the Q&A. Let me just remind you that it's now 12:31 EST. We have to close off at 1 and we must have time for Q&A and the vote. But right now, let me give Jean-Pierre the floor. I'm assuming he has now joined? No?
Yes, he has. His name is there.
I saw that, but I'm not hearing him. So, because I wanted to give him the opportunity to make his remarks. Laurent, are you there? No? So, all right. What we're going to, if he comes in, of course, we'll give him the floor. But right now we have, let me thank all the presenters and move now to the Q&A. And I have a question for Mr. Higuinho. Let me see if I can move up into the chat to find it. Basically, Mr. Higuinho, people want to know, you said that the Garifuna are descended from a mixture of Kalinago and African. But you also said that the Garifuna predated the arrival of Columbus. So somebody wants to ask you to explain that, if you could do that now.
Sure. This is a discussion we would like to, using scientific data to explore some more. I was reading Dr. Eric Williams's documents of history, right? And where he chronicles, Christopher Columbus is through his journal, just reading his journal, he was able to detect that there were, these forces in the Caribbean when Columbus came. And that tells me, to be able to resist, an armada, Spanish armada, from, being dominated, to be able to resist the French from dominating, and even the British. There must have been a presence, a strong presence on the island of St. Vincent. I was talking to somebody who was saying that the Garifunas were abandoned Barbados because it was, the geography was too easy for the colonialists to take over. So they went to St. Vincent's, which was hilly, right? And they have all this prior knowledge, and Dominica partly, where it was hilly, because they had this knowledge of guerrilla warfare. So that's my argument based on what was going on. And if you study the language of the Garifuna, it's to a large extent Carib Arawak. Mm-hmm. But the culture is very much Africana. So we need to put all these things together. And so I welcome this discussion because, the Europeans won't give us everything. So we need to put in some, fill in the blanks. And okay. That's our work. That's our work.
So that question was from Michael Adamson. There's another question for you. What strategies are there to mobilize the teaching of these unique traditions in our Caribbean schools? Is history a compulsory subject in Belize, for example? how is the culture passed on through education?
Well, the culture for, am I on? Yeah, the culture, my grandmother told me that the missionaries prohibited her from speaking the language at school. That's my grandmother. And when I was going to high school, it was not being taught. Even though the teachers were Garifuna, it was not being taught in the schools. How we preserve the language, perhaps, it's a blessing, perhaps a curse, is because we were kind of marooned in the community. We were not exposed to, the cities through, roads and so on. So it was handed down from, culture, through family. It was not part of the so-called formal educational system per se. So
how is it now? How is it
now? There are efforts, like for example, they just started a primary school in Grigo, where the language is being taught, by Garifuna teachers. So I think that school was there for 5 years now. It's a primary school, and so that's the most that there is to it.
Okay, and then another question for you, this time from the Bahamas, from Sharon Purcell Cooper. She's interested in the mention of Jonkono among the Garifuna people and how it compares with that of Jamaica and Bahamas. I don't know if you know anything about how Jonkono is performed in Jamaica and the Bahamas, but she just wanted to say that is interesting and whether you have any comparative information.
I don't have, but I am interested because the Garifunas were never enslaved, right? The Garifunas were never enslaved. We were always fighting until we got to the mainland. So to accept the myth that we were doing this dance for the slave master is a little bit off key for me, right? But certainly there were always merging and there was always communication among the African cultures in the Caribbean. And so we adopted it into our culture. There are several things we adopted, several things we shared, and so perhaps this was one of them.
Okay, well, I know that having visited Nigeria, I know that the Jonkono as performed in Nigeria is exactly the same as in Jamaica. I have not seen the one in the Bahamas, but I would imagine they have the same kind of roots. And then from YouTube, Bethany Cooper is asking about syncretic traditions of baths, etc. Because she finds that what you described appeared to be similar to revivalism in Jamaica. And so she would like to know more about this.
Was that a question from you, Professor Very?
Well, it's for anyone. I think you are the one who mentioned some of the survival traditions, surviving traditions. Yes. So I think it's still you.
So, well, the religious sector, which is, one of my interests, I think Dr. Leonard referred to it as animistic, right? Because the main religions, the Catholics and the Methodists and the Anglicans do not welcome our religion. And perhaps it comes as a way of survival. So we keep it as, even to a large extent, secrets, and we're having a hard time in terms of how do we pass on this religious practice that has been, despised by the more formidable religious sectors. And that's a challenge.
Okay. So there are a couple for, is Dr. Honeychurch still with us?
Yes, I am still here with you.
Right, okay. So I'm going to just pose the questions for you and for Dr. Bayer, and I'll pose them all, and then, we can, unless any more come in, we can, you can take turns. So for Zachary, from a question from YouTube, has there been advocacy to mitigate the white male destruction in Jamaica? What is the public education on this issue? And I think that's a very important question, because, is it or is it not true that another phase of road construction is going to go further into the Guatemala settlement. So hold to that one. For Dr. Honeychurch, there are some issues here. Clarify the issue of Arawak versus Caribs versus Taino versus Kalinago. I think people are still trying to wrap their heads around the terms because they were told, for example, that there's Kalinago, there is Karina, and then in Jamaica, we're told that there are not Arawaks, there are no Arawaks, we're to call them Taino. Then we're hearing that there were never Caribs, though we have heard the term used today. We're supposed to say Kalinago. Is there a female form and a male form in that name in in Dominica, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and so on? Then Dr. Leonard Honeychurch, still staying with you, because those latter questions are for you. There's another issue. Could you define genocide? And could you explain to the students the issue of genocide and survival of the indigenous people? Because there are people who believe genocide means no one should have survived. So if you could clarify. And then for everyone to make in your closing 30-second statement, say something about the issue of regionalism. And this has especially come up because of Dr. Byers' presentation. Because if this is happening in Jamaica, where is the outrage in the rest of the Caribbean? You couldn't have looked at those remains and not be moved, or to hear about the destruction. So in your closing 30 seconds for each of you, could you speak to the issue of where is the regional activism? And I think there's one final question about repatriation. And I think, Mr. Higuinho, this is for you, whether there is any move or advocacy or movement for repatriation from Belize to the source of some of those Garifuna people, Kalinago people and Garifuna people out of the Baliso experience. So I hope you have written down all of that. So let me start with, who now? Maybe Dr. Honeychurch, then Dr. Bayer, and then each person with a wrap-up comment.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, the first question related to Caribs, Arawaks, Garifuna, or whoever, Kalinago. This is a process that a lot of people in various parts of the world are talking about now, and this is the decolonizing of history. Because a lot of these names are names that really have been imposed from the outside, particularly from the time of Columbus. I mean, he heard about people that he thought were called Caniba, Cariba, Caribe, Caribe, and he heard all about this on his first voyage up in the Greater Antilles. And when he comes further south on his second voyage, and he does not land in Dominica, but he sails past and he stops off in the neighboring island of Guadeloupe, he basically says, oh, these are the Caniba. These are the Caniba. He just assumes that whatever he heard, and remember, these are languages that are totally separate. There is no link whatsoever, and the difficulty of picking up a language within that period of time is very close to impossible. But they tried what they could. And essentially, this Carib is this era which happened of Columbus's interpretation of what he heard in the Greater Antilles, and then what he saw in the Lesser Antilles. And the Arawaks is a general term which covers in people's minds all those early people who were there. But that again is something that enters the language, particularly the English language, in the time of Walter Raleigh, when Walter Raleigh is doing his expeditions to search for El Dorado. He comes across some people who call themselves the Arawaks, and then he links it to Arawaks generally, that is indigenous people. And then in the texts of the mid-17th century, you hear the missionaries who are trying to get information from the so-called Kalinago Caribs, what the French called Caribs. He gets the term Igneri, so that before the so-called Caribs came, there were the Igneri. And it gets increasingly confusing. So this is an area of decolonization. But essentially, so much of it is actually a European construct following the first voyage of Columbus. Because Columbus was the one who started, and the Spanish later on, calling them Indians, because they felt that they had reached the outskirts of the Indies, of India. And that, of course, has stayed with us forever. But in terms of the Kalinago, the term began being used when the missionary, Father Raymond Breton, who was also an early linguist, was collecting information from the Kalinago people of Dominica and of Guadeloupe, where he was resident for some time, but mainly in Dominica. And he says quite clearly in his dictionary, Français Caraïbe, that they say this is not what they call themselves, that they really call themselves the Kalinago, and in the women's language, the Garifuna, which then we pick up in St. Vincent with the G, Garifuna. And the similarities in language, for instance, when my colleague Higuinho, that is Egbert Higuinho, talked at the beginning and welcomed everybody, he used a term which is very similar to the Kalinago in Dominica, mabuika, but it was kind of pronounced rather differently. So you see how there's these links across the region, but that they're using essentially the same language that they have carried from one end of the Caribbean to the other. So this is a project that we still have to work on, clarifying that issue of the naming of the people, the decolonization of nomenclature, if you want, the decolonizing of names. It's difficult, almost impossible, to find out what the people call themselves in 1492 or even 1493. You pick up some things here and there in the Greater Antilles, but it's extremely difficult. And then what makes it more complex is we now have the archaeologists who have been putting archaeological terms on the artifacts that they find. So you will say, oh, the first group to have settled in that, the first horticultural people and pottery making people in the Lesser Antilles were the Saladoid. But that is an archaeological term which was never used by the indigenous people, but it helps to identify the style of pottery, and then it moves on to other styles which names have been given by the archaeologists. So this is a continuing challenge, and it is a work in progress, let's put it that way. Just a quick one on genocide. We use the term decimated very often. Oh, the Taino were decimated. But if you look at the correct meaning of the term, it doesn't mean that everybody was swept away. Basically, they were cut down by a percentage. And genocide would indicate in some cases a wide destruction of an entire ethnic group, whereas in others it would be an act of genocide would be the complete destabilization of that society, which makes it impossible for them to continue living in the manner in which they used to live. Mm-hmm. So you have committed genocide. It isn't that you have made these people, strip them from the face of the earth, but you have completely disrupted their ethnic patterns of living and life and zones of occupation.
Okay.
That's the way I would interpret it.
So we can still talk in terms of a colonial project that had a genocidal intent, and in fact impact in certain ways, because that's part of the repatriatory justice movement, to say that there was a genocidal act. And if you look at the correspondence and the intention of Europeans, we see that that is what they intended. And we have figures to show the drastic reduction of population anyway. So thank you for that. So let me go to Dr. Bayer now.
Yes, and just quickly, you know, I think following genocidal acts are the repercussions in the present, right? Almost a state of amnesia or denial, which I think is another one of these repercussions that could be introduced. But advocacy and Prof, you know, I'm not a politician, but you've always encouraged me to be forward when it comes to this type of the importance of this type of research and the need for advocacy. So while I'm a foreigner, I'm not a politician. My work in Jamaica, I'm an educator. So much of my advocacy is going on with my students, creating a new generation, not only of aware individuals, but active, these individuals that can fill the roles of stewards of these resources, cultural resource managers, archaeologists, historians, but also with my position with the JNHT, that has largely taken on the role of attempting to slow things down. I will tell you though, at least in Jamaica, and maybe this is a broader topic for regionalism, there's a clear need to change laws, to revise laws. Permissions are taking place behind closed doors. When funding is secured, these plans are in place, no matter what is in the way. If there was clear laws stating the process of permissions, that in order to receive permission, an impact assessment, a strategic investigation of the entire impacted area would have to be done. This is a process that I'm more familiar with, being raised in the United States, knowing those laws. We need to see that level of language and enforcement across the Caribbean, and most certainly with my work in White Marl, that I don't know if you can stop the earth movers at this point. I have a feeling once this pandemic passes, it's going to be prosperity as usual, and prosperity in the current mode cares not for preservation, especially of sites seemingly that they're prehistoric. They're not us. They don't look like us. They very different cultural connections, amnesia or disassociation. I think through laws, education, and obviously collaboration, we could see projects like this actually go through the necessary permissions and also be discussed in the public space. It seems so often that these things never make it into news stories. In the area that we were working in, it's more likely that you hear about recent murder victims than you hear about the 1,000-year-old burials and other significant information to Jamaican identity.
Okay.
So needs a lot of work.
And we need a lot of advocates. And I'm really going to put Honorable Kozia Frederick in the hot seat, and Senor Higuinho, and all our Kalinago, Taino friends globally, because we can't allow this to happen. You cannot allow this to happen. This is not right. And we do need some very brave people right now. But let me ask Mr. Higuinho to answer the final question about repatriation. Is there a move for that to St. Vincent and the Grenadines from Belize?
Yes, I know of several, I don't want to call them pilgrimage, but several groups that have gone to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in what we would call cultural retrieval projects, and a different cultural retrieval projects. And even to Balisau itself, to look at the site of genocide. And I know a cousin lives not too far away from me, told me the bones are still out there, and the bones are still out there, and the barrenness, right, of that situation tells me that we haven't quite focused on the trauma, right? The trauma, the psychological damage. And so that when we look at history as if it is some kind of glorified dotted line, right? We haven't addressed, the psychological damage, right, that has done throughout the process as we come to.
So there's return and pilgrimage, but no call for, a general resettlement.
Yes.
Take one from Belize and put them back in St. Vincent. There's not that.
There's not that. There's not that. And I know of a group of Honduras. I just want to say there's another group of Honduras that also did visit and, are following up. Yeah.
All right. Before I give the floor to Mr. Bousquet to give the vote of thanks, let me just ask Honorable Kozia Frederick if he has any closing remarks.
Yes, Prof. Thank you very much. I would really love the conversation to move beyond the sort of narrow defining of indigenous peoples and the name and who came first, who came after. The fact remains that we existed. And there's evidence to suggest that. And our history did not start with colonization, and it goes beyond independence as international, as nations itself. It goes beyond that. And to say that in terms of bringing the regional aspect or regional advocacy into this discussion, every Caribbean country should take on the United Nations rights of indigenous people, because there's evidence in every single country. So it's not just for Dominica because we have an existing population. It is something that has to go across the board. So when we seek for financing for explorations, when we seek to preserve the heritage against massive infrastructure developments like roads, we do not have the burden of any single state creating laws and creating barriers. We have to take it as a collective. Right. So we need, because when you go to Europe, how do you differentiate between a German and a British person? How do you do that? How do we do it? And why do we want to create that sort of categories in our sacred space? And so we need to move beyond that, and we need to create a space that with an understanding by everyone, not just academics, not just people in political circles, but the layman on the road should know that the essence of the space he's in now as a Caribbean region, it's one that is deeply built on indigenous heritage. And that would be the defining point for regionalism, I think.
Okay. But I still hold to my point about having a regional response to any threat anywhere to the memory and the sacred space. So I'm still leaving that with you. All right. So let me now turn to Earl Bousquet to give the vote of thanks before I wrap. Mr. Bousquet, you have to unmute, please. We can't hear. Mr. Bousquet, please unmute.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Shepherd. And like everybody else here, I am very pleased to have attended today's virtual class on the issue that we have just discussed, and coming out of it with lessons having learned about the commonalities that exist across our region. And I do support the calls repeated by the professor for us to work on ensuring the sort of regional response that is necessary, because as we speak, there are such projects taking place in most of the territories where increasingly the indigenous burial places are coming up, and those issues are still being dealt with at a national level. So there is room for regional response. So now for the vote of thanks. At the end of every successful event, enough thanks must be said. And to this end, our first profuse thanks must go to the UWI's Center for Reparations Research in Jamaica for its organizational and coordinating arrangements and hosting of this second in the year-long monthly regional secondary schools virtual lecture series. And of course, we heartily thank our two main presenters, acclaimed Caribbean historian Dr. Honeychurch and the Garifuna chief of Belize, Mr. Higuinho, for their informative and thought-provoking presentations. None other could have done it better. Heartfelt thanks too to Dominica's Minister for Rural Modernization and Kalinago Upliftment, Honorable Kozia Frederick, for gracing our discussions. We say enough thanks to Mrs. Josephine Dublin Prince, member of the Dominican Reparations Committee, for her welcome greeting. Enough thanks as well to our discussants. Dr. Leslie Gail Atkinson Swaby was not able to join us, but certainly we thank her for having indicated a will to so do, and similarly to Mr. Laurent Jomo Jean-Pierre of St. Lucia, who continued trying up until the end to log in. But in that regard, we want to thank also Dr. Zachary Bear, who, along with the Dominica minister, was able to give us that look of what's happening in Jamaica vis-a-vis Dominica, where he had also been, and other areas. Enough thanks also go to the CRR and the special CRR subcommittee in Jamaica, also quietly overseeing hosting and coordination of today's and the remaining 10 of the year-long monthly online school lectures in the current series. Enough thanks, therefore, to Mr. John Shorter and his team in Kingston, Gabriel, etc., for their professional execution of tasks across seas and skies. The St. Lucia NRC joins the CRR in specially thanking the UWI Open Campus for its central role in ensuring the success of the school lectures, the first launched in St. Lucia in September, on the 25th of September, by none other than the inimitable Professor Shepherd. The open campus units in St. Lucia, Barbados, and Jamaica have, from the very outset of the parallel national and regional online reparations lecture series on August 20th, promptly and efficiently executed their mandate each time to ensure these lectures reach each and every one of us at home, at school, at work, wherever. And this both serves and requires enough special thanks to Mr. Cleveland Sam, Marketing and Communications Manager of the UWI Open Campus Barbados, and his team for all they have done behind the scenes and between occasional screams, behind the scenes, to ensure we link our lectures to students, teachers, principals, schools around the Caribbean and in fact around the world. And a similar unseen but ongoing behind the scenes role is also being played by the University of the West Indies, UWI TV Global, which is also quietly supporting the NRC's lecture series, following on its global broadcast of the successful June 12th Regional Youth Reparations Conference, also coordinated by the Center for Reparations Research, and the June 16 Sir Arthur Lewis International Seminar, SALIS 20, hosted by the St. Lucia NRC earlier this year. Also quietly but strongly supporting our parallel lecture series is the CARICOM Reparations Commission and its chair, the Venerable Vice Chancellor of the UWI, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, and the CRC's coordinator, Dr. Hilary Brown at the CARICOM Secretariat. And we offer enough thanks to the chair, the commissioners, and all other national research committees for their ongoing support for these lectures. In this regard, the St. Lucia NRC, the CRC, and the CRR also want to profusely thank the Dominica NRC for its central role in supporting the successful execution of this event. Our special thanks also go to Ambassador Dr. Damien Dublin, the chair of the Dominica NRC, and all the Dominican presenters today for taking time off serious preparations for the 41st Independence anniversary next week to grace us with their presence today, despite the inclement weather. We thank the schools, the students, and the teachers in Belize, Dominica, Jamaica, and St. Lucia, amongst those who logged in this morning, and all the unnamed and unknown entities everywhere who graced us with their presence today. Now, I did not save the best for last because the best can never be the last in line, but I have reserved our moderator for our final and fullest thanks for the way she conducted today's session, as well as for her consistent, committed support to and participation in virtually every successful online reparations education endeavor that we have been part of. Professor Shepherd's leadership of the CRR and her role as a vice chair of the CRC and of the Jamaica National Council for Reparations are all enveloped in that head below her trademark headgear, and her accumulated experience as a global fighter for reparations continues to be shared across the region through lectures like these. To Professor Shepherd for her continuing role in taking the reparations message to the region and the world, and especially to the students and teachers today, we not only say enough thanks, but enough respect. And finally, we want to alert every one of you, every one of our viewers and listeners, and invite each of you to join the St. Lucia NRC's next monthly National Reparations Lecture, which will take place on November 19. Mark the date, 19th of November, to be delivered by the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, Ambassador Dr. June Suma, who is also chairperson of the UWI Open Campus. The topic is First People, Last Citizens, from Native Genocide to National Isolation. What next? Well, what next? We will see you again right here, same time, same station, these days, these same two UWI Open Campus and Facebook and YouTube links from 7 p.m. on November 19, the third Thursday of November. And the CRR's next schools lecture will be on November 26, 1 week later, and it will be entitled Conquest, Colonization, and the Imperial Project. Both November lectures to be advertised by the usual virtual flyers. And now back to our studios. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. And that's a comprehensive vote of thanks, so I don't have to add anything. But can I just say, I asked in the chat if there was any student who asked a question. I haven't seen an answer, but I was gonna give away a copy of the latest work on reparation. This is a special issue of Social and Economic Studies, volume 68, numbers 2 and 3, 2019. Lots of important contributions from our scholars. It will be an online version very soon. So if anyone can send me a message, if any student had asked a question, let me know so I can arrange to give this volume to our students. And in every school's lecture, we're going to have giveaways. So of books, by the way, not phone credits, books, because you need to read. Some of those books will be online. So keep informed. I also wanted to thank Dr. Sandra Gift, because the Center for Reparation doesn't have, the number of staff to keep us going. So we depend on volunteers. She has come on board as a volunteer and as a member of the scholar the network of scholars of the center. So I wanted to thank her because she's on this team working for the success of these lectures. And so we have come to the end. I really want to wish everyone a safe navigation of COVID-19, to say how sorry we are to hear about the rising deaths in our region and globally, and to wish a speedy recovery to those right now who are battling this virus. To urge everyone to take it seriously, observe all the protocols. And finally to say, I forgot one comment. Somebody from Belize is saying we forgot the Maya people, Senor Higuinho. So next time, and of course, in the third lecture, there is scope to talk about the other communities that we did not cover today because we can't cover everyone. But I wanted to raise that because it's very much on the syllabus, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and all the other communities of First Nation peoples. So we haven't forgotten, and we will of course ensure we do this in the future. And so I want to say that what is quite obvious today from all the presentations and interventions is that where people are still using the theory of distant to defeat our efforts towards reparatory justice. It's too long ago in the past. Those are dead people. We don't pay reparation for dead people. They are not connected to us. But we have to destabilize this theory of distant because the past is very much connected to the present. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you.